Hello, welcome to the Worcester Public Schools Custodial 2-hour asbestos awareness training. My name is Lynn Rose, and I've been the Environmental Health and Safety Consultant at Worcester Public Schools for over the last decade. Today, we're going to talk about a school-specific requirement for managing asbestos in schools called a HERA. And the goal of today's training is to help you understand what asbestos is, the hazards of asbestos, where to get information on asbestos-containing materials, where it is likely to be found in Worcester Public Schools buildings, and where you might encounter it in your work, how regulations protect you and building occupants, how to prevent asbestos exposure to yourself and other building staff. I want to start by talking about the quiz that you're going to need to fill out to get credit for this training. So we developed this quiz in order to help you remember the most important information that we'll be providing. And because that is the goal, you are welcome to take this quiz while you're listening to the video. That way, if you need to pause it or rewind it, you can do that as many times as you need to in order to complete the answers. So please return this quiz to Kristen Tran by the date listed in the email. You start by defining what is asbestos. It's a group of naturally occurring minerals found in rock. As you can see on the right, they have long, thin fibers that are formed from the crystals within the rock. And one fiber can continue to split into smaller and smaller fibers. And these fibers can be up to 700 times smaller than a human hair. So what does that look like in reality? Let's compare it to a penny. And on that penny on the left is 2 to 3 grains of rice. On the bottom right is 5 to 6 human hairs, and in the middle is 20,000 asbestos fibers. So that just to give you a little perspective, and that if you wanted to see an asbestos fiber, you really need to look under a microscope. And why this is important is because when you see what you think is asbestos released into the air, typically what it is, it's the substrate that the fiber is embedded in that you see in the air. Like if you see a broken ceiling tile, you'll probably see the material that the asbestos is bound up in, and you're not necessarily going to see the asbestos itself. And we will talk in a little while about why the size of it is important. So let's talk about the types of asbestos that there are. And the reason I like to define this is it will help you think about where to find asbestos in the building. But let's first talk about the type of asbestos, the type of minerals. So we have what's called serpentine, and chrysotile is a white asbestos, which is one of the predominant ones used in building materials. Like 95% of building materials uses chrysotile. Then we have the amphibole, and within that, anthracite is brown, is second most commonly used in building materials. Then we have chrysotile, which is blue, and that is used for high temperature insulation products and on chemical resistant surfaces like lab tables. So these are the 3 that are used in building construction. Then we have 3 more that come under amphibole category that are actually contaminants that can be found in some products such as talcum powder, vermiculite, which is used in soil mixes, and other blown-in insulation. And they are not typically used in commercial production, but it's important to know because they are found as some contaminants. So I like to talk about what the useful properties of asbestos are because, again, the more you understand its properties, the easier it's going to be for you to figure out where you're going to find it in the building. So it is so useful. It was mined and processed for manufacturing for over 3,000 products. And that is because it's virtually indestructible, and it has many, many, many multi-purpose properties, including resistance to chemicals, corrosion, and temperature changes. So think about it. Chemicals are found in chemistry labs, corrosion. So they put asbestos in the vent hoods of a fume hood for a chemistry lab because the corrosive vapors will not destroy it. And temperature changes, you would find them on HVAC systems, on plumbing systems. It also doesn't burn or transmit electricity, so you will find it throughout electrical systems. It insulates well and absorbs sound. So this is great because you'll find it in school hallways, you'll find it in auditoriums, music rooms, and you'll see this throughout hotel rooms because it's both an insulator and absorbs sound. It adds strength to materials, so you will find it used virtually everywhere. It's used in roofing and siding and wallboard and flooring, and it's all because it adds strength. It doesn't break down easily, evaporate into the air, or dissolve. So that's great because it's really, a durable product. The problem is when it gets into your body, if your body can't break it down, then it becomes a health hazard. And it was considered cost effective until it became regulated. And then once it was regulated, you have to do training and personal protection and inspection whenever you're either maintaining it in place or disturbing, repairing, removing, or disposing of it. So it is a very expensive material to deal with at this point, but initially it was not. So the regulatory definition of asbestos, it must have between 1% and 100% asbestos to be considered an asbestos-containing material under federal law. A few years ago, though, Massachusetts decided that they would regulate any amount of asbestos in a building material. And that is because when the asbestos is released from a material, even if it's under 1%, depending on the quantity released, it can add up and cause a health hazard. There's a term called asbestos-containing building materials, and that is asbestos-containing material that is found in or on the interior structural members or other parts of a school building. And we are going to be using the term ACM, asbestos-containing material, just to abbreviate it for this purpose. But the materials that we will be talking about today are all related to building materials. There are two forms of asbestos-containing materials, and the reason they break it down into these two categories is they're regulated differently, and it also helps you think about them. So there's non-friable. An example of that is a glue dab that holds on a ceiling tile, which is usually attached to it, or you can see adjacent to it. So a friable material is a ceiling tile, and non-friable is a glue dab. Well, those are just examples. So what is the difference? So non-friable means it's a material that does not easily crumble. And that's because it has some type of bonding agent in it. So it's embedded in vinyl. So they call it a vinyl asbestos tile. So think about vinyl. It does not easily crumble. It's a pretty tough stuff. And the adhesive is just a glue. They call it the mastic that holds the tile in place. Again, that doesn't easily crumble either. That's pretty tough stuff. So the official definition is you cannot crumble, pulverize, or reduce it to a powder by hand pressure. And this material can become friable, which means release fibers, when it becomes damaged on purpose by sanding, cutting, or abrading, or if it gets damaged for other reasons. And undamaged non-friable asbestos should be treated as friable if anything that you do or any types of damage makes them friable. So what does friable mean? Friable means that it releases fibers really easily. It crumbles really easily, and because of that, it releases fibers really easily. So the official definition of friable is a material that may be crumbled, pulverized, or reduced to a powder by hand pressure when dry, which means it's easily crumbled. Because of that, it has a higher hazard level than non-friable. So friable release fibers into the air more readily than non-friable. Thus, it is the most hazardous. I want to give you just a few examples, and we're gonna do a deep dive into all these materials. But as you can see in the picture, an example of friable material would be a decorative paint or a spray-on fireproofing. And these are just like a surface application, so they're more easily disturbed. Thermal system insulation would be something that's on your boiler, on your pipes. Plaster, plaster over plaster and lath. Ceiling tiles. So these are what are considered friable. So we'll talk more in detail. But I wanted to step back and have you look at a building in general. And so that you could see the sheer magnitude of asbestos used in buildings. And if you look at this, you'll see that it's used all the way from the top of the building on the roof to the siding, to down in the basement, to the mechanical room, to the HVAC system in the mechanical rooms. It's used in putty and windows, on drop ceilings, on the ceiling tiles, on duct work. So we will walk through all these materials more specifically, but I want you to step back and just get a sense of this is a material that was used extensively for all types of building materials. And so where would you find this information about any Worcester public school building? Because not all buildings have these, and you might find some, but not all. So you're going to want to know in each building that you're working in, which materials are of a concern. So there are inspection reports in what we call on-site asbestos management plans. And we will actually walk you through how to read these inspection reports so you can learn how to find the asbestos in your building. And here's a close-up. So we went from the big picture whole building down to the classroom. And as you can see, even in just a classroom alone, you can have it on the walls, you can have it on the ceiling, you can have it on the floor. And then there's the hidden stuff, right? There's the glue dabs behind the whiteboard. There's insulation on pipes above the ceiling. You can even have on the window frame, you'll have putty. So this is not an extensive list, and not all classrooms will have all of this, but this gives you a sense close up in one space. You can have asbestos throughout one room. So they further break down these categories of asbestos containing material into the following three. And again, these is what they use as a basis to regulate asbestos. So there's surfacing, thermal system insulation, and miscellaneous all other. And surfacing, number one, and number two, thermal system insulation are friable. And so they are regulated differently because they're more hazardous than miscellaneous all other. So I'm going to walk you through these so that you'll remember more specifically. So what is surfacing? It is asbestos containing material that's either sprayed or troweled onto interior surfaces. If you look at that first picture, you can see the man is spraying onto the ceiling. It's also being sprayed on the beam. So those are structural members. And if you remember in the trade towers, the beams were sprayed. So when the building came down, it released asbestos into the air. So you can have it sprayed on throughout a room or a structure, right? Structural members, walls, ceilings, pipes. And that's just an example. And then on the right, you look, this is where it's troweled on, and it's on insulation on a kitchen hood exhaust pipe. So the reason that surfacing is a higher risk material is it's a surface application. So it's more easily disturbed and more easily releases fibers. What was surfacing material used for? Acoustical soundproofing. So I have seen it in, lots of hotel rooms. I've seen it in auditoriums, music rooms. And because it's also good for fireproofing and insulation, you get a lot of bang for your buck when you use asbestos surfacing material. The other thing you'll see is textured paints and ceiling textured products. And they contain a fairly low level of asbestos, only about 5%, but is very friable. And as you'll notice, some of the risk in this situation is that people tend to poke holes in the ceiling, and you can see there for lights, for wires, for the sprinkler system. You might see it for IT. You might see it for security systems. So people are always poking holes in walls and ceilings. And this is why we need to pay attention to what the materials are. So another surfacing material is plaster. Now, plaster could be either over gypsum board, lath, or brick. And there may be up to 3 layers of plaster that contain asbestos. You could have 1 layer or you could have all 3. So the bottom thick base layer can have it, the thin skim layer, or the textured finishing layer. So let's recap what surfacing is. It's sprayed on or troweled on. It's friable, which means it easily releases fibers. Okay, so that's the first category of asbestos-containing material. Let's move on to the second category. What is thermal system insulation? It is used to prevent heat loss or gain or prevent condensation. It is applied to heating, venting, air conditioning systems, and water systems. So it can be either on one part or throughout the system on pipes, boilers, ducts, tanks. So remember condensation, because we're going to come back to how asbestos is used to prevent condensation. So here's what it looks like on a thermal, the thermal system insulation looks on a boiler. It can either be outside the boiler and on the piping and on the boiler itself, or it can be internal where you wouldn't see it. You can have it on the boiler doors, the access windows, plates, flues, manholes. You can also see it where the boiler connects to the piping and other equipment. It can be in the packing and gaskets of boiler components such as valves and pumps. And that's why mechanical rooms typically are a site where we will find asbestos. So there is asbestos millboard, and these sheets were used for insulation, and they were used either on the ceilings and walls near machinery producing heat, such as ovens and furnaces, or they can actually be used on the ovens and furnaces themselves. And they're also used to wrap large diameter pipes. Now we're going to move into a family of thermal system insulation, which is the piping. So we'll start with the elbows. So you'll see using mud, they call it mud, which is just a mixture of asbestos and cement. It's on the elbows, joints, valves, reducers, hangers. It's not typically on the, it's not linear on the pipe run. Typically it's on an elbow, and it can be wrapped in painted or non-painted canvas. Occasionally you might find it as just bare mud, which is where it's more high risk because it more easily releases the fibers. It can also be used as a thin layer over a fiberglass insulation, which is then wrapped with canvas. This mud can contain between a wide range, like 5% to 90% asbestos. That's a very wide range, and that can be quite a bit of asbestos. Moving on to pipe run and elbow insulation, block insulation is used and is generally found on high temperature steam lines. It is preformed as 2 half circle pieces that fit around a pipe, and that can contain a high amount between 50 and 90% asbestos. So another type of pipe run insulation is air cell insulation, and that's only found on straight runs, not on elbows. It looks just like corrugated cardboard, and it can contain quite a bit in a wide range, anywhere from 25 to 90% asbestos. And this becomes crumbly as it ages, so it can release large quantities of asbestos dust if you either cut it off to work on the pipe or if it is damaged by accident. So there's Brown solid fibrous insulation, another type of pipe run and fitting insulation, and that is used on pipe runs and elbows on high temperature steam lines. That contains 90% asbestos and is very friable. So you don't need to remember so much how much asbestos is in each thing. I think what's important here is that if you've noted, most of the insulation on pipes and elbows contains or has the potential to contain a high amount of asbestos. Then on the outside is white construction paper insulation, and that's sometimes found on pipe runs where it covers layers of felt and fiberglass, and then it's wrapped with canvas. And that contains a much lower amount, from 1 to 5%. Okay, so that kind of wraps up that section. And I want to wrap it up with the question is that asbestos or is that asbestos? And how can you tell? Test. So that's asbestos and that is not asbestos. Another thing on the thermal system that you'll find, you're aware of ducts. But the thing that's tricky about this is some of the insulation is obvious because it's on the outside, but ducts can also have asbestos insulation on the inside. Duct insulation can also be made of flat asbestos paper or corrugated asbestos paper. And one thing to remember is there's what's visible in terms of the ducts in a room, but more typically it's hidden behind walls and ceilings and floors. There's also joint duct tape. So asbestos seam tape and asbestos seam tape on air duct. There's also duct vibration dampening cloth, also called a flux connector. And when it's made from asbestos, it's usually a very coarse weave and it's a pure asbestos fiber, where the non-asbestos flux connector is a much finer weave, but that's not something that we would try and determine. That would have to be tested. There's asbestos rope that's used in plumbing, ductwork, and boiler doors as a gasket. This can become friable due to the heat. It's also used in pipe gaskets, wherever two stationary pieces of metal are brought together in a flange joint in equipment handling liquids and gases. So let's recap asbestos containing materials that are both surfacing and thermal system. So those are the first two categories, and they are both friable, and they both more easily release fibers. So surfacing is the first, thermal system insulation is the second. Then we're moving on to a category called miscellaneous all other, and that is material that's used on structural components in structural members or fixtures, such as floor tile or ceiling tile. But it does not include the first two categories that we just discussed. It does not include surfacing or thermal system. So just before we move into specific materials, typically the miscellaneous all other is more bound up in the materials that it's manufactured in and is not friable. So I wanted to show you what a number of different types of valve packings can look like. It comes in different colors. It can come in different braids and woven patterns. So it's commonly used as joint packing, but it comes in a whole range of products. Transite pipes. So transite pipes really are just cement and asbestos, but the name transite started out as a trade name by John Mansfield for a combination of asbestos cement, a mixture of asbestos and cement. But now people tend to refer to anything made with asbestos and cement as transite. So although it started as a trade name, it's referred to any building material with those two ingredients. So here's a perfect example of where asbestos was added because of its strength. and its rigidity. It was used inside buildings for sanitary sewer drain pipe, also for vent pipe for gas appliances, water heaters, floor furnaces, and general gravity furnaces, which are those older systems which use gravity to move heat. Here's a category of asbestos where it's really a contaminant. It is not a manufactured product. It is vermiculite, and typically used also, it's used in soil mixes, but where you would find it in a building is in loose fill insulation. So vermiculite ore came from a mine in Libby, Montana, and it accounted for more than half of the worldwide production from 1925 to 1990. And this vermiculite, much of it was used in a product called zolanite. It's attic insulation, but you need to know, although a high percentage of vermiculite was mined from this mine in Libby, not all zolanite product was made from this mine. But anytime you see blown in insulation, it has to be tested to determine whether or not it does have the contaminated vermiculite. I've only seen the vermiculite in a school in the blown in insulation in one school building, but it was in a situation where it was an added on structure within the building. I don't know how prevalent it is, but whenever it is found, it must be tested. So here's a product that could be throughout parts of a building. So drywall products, and that includes drywall tape, gypsum board, and drywall joint compound. And the thing is, it was sold as either a mixed paste or a powder. And the reason that makes a difference is the mixed ready mix had a kind of a certain amount in it, and it could have been from 3 to 15%, where the powder was mixed on site by workers. So what that presents in terms of an issue is that we do not know what the levels of asbestos were put in this joint compound. Earlier, we discussed that asbestos is used to prevent condensation. So here is a perfect example where it was used under sinks to prevent condensation. It was used in window putty. So this is very easily friable, as you can see. And this is one of the things that whenever we pull windows to replace them, they are always tested for asbestos. Then there's asbestos ceiling tiles, and they can be found in all sizes and types. They can be found in a drop suspended acoustical ceilings. They can come in 1x1, 2x2, 2x4, 1.5x6 sizes. They can be square, rectangular. And the thing is, you could have a mix of asbestos and non-asbestos tiles in the same ceiling system. And if you think about it, the reason for that is we typically only replace them if they get stained or broken or are missing. Here's an example of a pattern I'm very familiar with that was throughout a building where students were throwing things up at the ceiling and knocking them down. So when they're knocked down is when they can, or they're broken, they deteriorate. You move them around when you push them up and push them over to get into the ceiling. You can damage them. They can start to get deteriorated. They can get vandalized. And then they become damaged by water when you have a roof leak or a pipe leak, and they can fall down. Vinyl sheet flooring might be found in some of our older buildings, and it can also have an asbestos sheet underneath it. Here's brown caulk at a pipe penetration. And then we have insulating board. So here's another case where you have, it's used for strength, and it's used throughout a building, and the range of asbestos that might be found is between 15 and 40%. So this is where you see very many purposes. So used for fire protection, acoustical insulation, partitioning in a space, a general building board, or as a core for other products such as fire doors. So this picture on the right is outside a building, but inside the building, it can be used as a pipe chase, ceiling, and this the reason I put this particular picture is because I get really concerned when I walk through a building and I see all these penetrations, and we don't always, way back when people didn't know to check before they popped holes into walls and ceilings, and you see this a lot running cable, running electric, running phone. And here it is used for acoustical purposes in a school hallway. You know what it's like when there's when an elephant herd of kids go through the hallway. So it's a perfect type of building material for that. Then the most prevalent product in a school asbestos containing material is the vinyl asbestos tile. And it is found in most 9-inch tiles and a few 12-inch tiles. So here's an example. They were manufactured between 1920 and 1960, but they were installed right up until the 80s because it's a situation where, although they might have stopped manufacturing them, there's still a stock that was sold and installed. And actually, they're still made today. Some of the 12 by 12s still have asbestos in them. You will find the mastic, which is like a glue, under the vinyl asbestos tile and under the rubber cove where the tile meets the wall. You'll even find under ceramic cove. Here it is, mastic on plywood. Okay, here's the example that I gave you of a fume hood where you would have vapors that are corrosive going up there, but because the asbestos does not corrode, it's the perfect material. Then you have the asbestos cement lab countertop, and that's like you can spill chemicals on it and it will not corrode. So here's an example of a transite sheet. Remember, transite is cement and asbestos mixed together, used for strength. Here's asbestos in a fire curtain where it's woven in. People don't use these anymore, and if they're found, they're removed. So here's asbestos used as the core of a fire door. So between the 60s until the late 80s, manufacturers used them in different kinds of fire doors. And as we said before with the tiles, although it might have stopped being manufactured in the 80s, they continued to use it into the 90s, use up the stock that they had. So they were used in B class and C class fire rated doors, which often contain large amounts of asbestos in their cores. So how would you tell if a fire door contained asbestos? Well, you could look at these little plaques, plates, or labels on the door spine. So they may or may not be listed. So the plate alone is not sufficient to determine if it contains asbestos. You could look at your inspection report in your on-site management plan, but something we'll talk about in a minute is we do not do what's called invasive testing. So we would not drill a hole in this door to find out if this door is compromised or you changed a lock and you could see to the inside, it might be sampled, or it might be sampled when you go to dispose of it, but typically you will not know. So if you cannot tell, you have to presume that all original fire doors installed in buildings prior to 1990 contain asbestos. So let's move on to talking about asbestos containing materials in electrical systems. We're still in miscellaneous category. And the thing about asbestos in electrical systems, electrical applications, the reason it was used is because it doesn't conduct electricity, is insulating, is resistant to heat and fire, and is durable. So it has many, many qualities which make it a good product to use in electrical systems. It was used in both higher voltage AC and DC electrical wiring, as well as low voltage wiring products such as telephone cabling. Not all electric equipment contains asbestos because it was largely phased out around 1980. And this is just to give you an example. You don't have to remember this, but just know, because you're not an electrician, but just to know: wire, cable, conduit, breakers, panels, partitions, backing boards, electric boxes and cabinets, and your controller boxes for motors, generators, and other equipment can contain asbestos. I just want to show you an example of wiring. So it's hard to tell from looking at these which are asbestos. The asbestos insulation on them, in this case, is between 10 and 30%. And they were called AF wire, for asbestos fiber wire. So let's recap the miscellaneous all other. This category contains asbestos-containing material that is not friable, and it is used for a wide variety of building materials. Remember, it was used for strength, its fire resistance, its insulating properties, its soundproofing properties. So let's recap: there's surfacing, thermal system insulation, and miscellaneous all other. So aside from the specific kinds that I just walked you through, I want you to just have a general awareness that in your work area, you might encounter asbestos. It's hidden there's hidden pipes and ducts behind walls, ceilings, and floors. You might encounter debris in a work area or a crawl space or an attic where people haven't been in a long time. If there's a water leak, particularly, around any of the piping, or a steam leak, you could see a release of asbestos. And I have a question for you. Do you think all of these materials we just discussed always contain asbestos? What does presumed, assumed, suspected asbestos-containing materials mean? So this is a case where you are guilty until proven innocent. And so that is because, due to the prevalence of the use of asbestos in certain materials, like flooring, ceiling tiles, during a certain time period, they are assumed, suspected, or presumed to contain asbestos until they are tested and proven not guilty. So there's different terms depending if it's talking to OSHA, but the bottom line is anything that was very commonly manufactured with asbestos is considered and required to be treated as if it's asbestos. So Worcester Public Schools does assume, inspect, and manage certain materials as asbestos containing until they're tested and proven not. And we do that with certain materials that were generated, between up to the 1980s for the most part. So materials used in the United States were before the 1940s, but the predominant use, the most common, was between the 1940s and the 1980s. And as you can see, it was used before and it was used after. So the reason that this chart is so important is if you know that you're in a school that was built before the 1990s, like say mid 80s, then you can assume that there are materials in that building that contain asbestos. So that's how you know you're dealing with a building that possibly contains asbestos. And is it legal or is it illegal to have asbestos in your building? Do they still manufacture asbestos? It is still used in the United States and other countries, and it is not illegal to have in your building. So although some asbestos-containing materials are banned from production, some are still sold and used. But one of the problems we run into is not all asbestos is labeled asbestos. So we have to get documentation from companies and architects. The thing is that it is illegal to reapply asbestos surfacing or thermal system insulation. The reason is, do you remember? So both of these categories release fibers more easily because they're friable. That is why it is illegal to reapply asbestos surfacing or thermosystem insulation, is because it's friable, which produces more of a hazard due to inhalation. So what is our exposure risk in a school building? Asbestos-containing materials are not generally considered to be harmful unless they are releasing fibers into the air where you can inhale or ingest them. United States Environmental Protection Agency, the Massachusetts Department of Labor Standards, and the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection considers asbestos to pose little risk if it is well maintained and not releasing fibers into the air where they can be inhaled. They only require removal to prevent exposure if there has been a release and during building demolition or renovation activities. So why do airborne fibers pose both an immediate and possibly a longer term exposure risk? Because asbestos fibers are so small, as we discussed at the beginning of this training, once they're released in the air, they may stay suspended for hours or even days, depending on the ventilation in the room. And once they settle down, they can become airborne again and again and again. So how does asbestos get inside of your body? So how does it get from the building into the side of our body? We call this a route of exposure. This is how it gets inside. So inhalation is the primary route of exposure, and all types of asbestos are hazardous to inhale. These fibers can become trapped in our mucous membranes of our noses and throat, but we can also remove them by coughing and sneezing. Due to their tiny nature, some of them may pass deep into our lungs where they become trapped, or if swallowed, they can get into our digestive tract, which is not thought to be a route of exposure for the most part in a school building. So let's see what that exactly looks like. What happens when we swallow an asbestos fiber?
Asbestos fibers are much finer than a human hair and are invisible to the naked eye. When they are released, they float in the air and are then sometimes breathed in by human beings. The human body is equipped with two defense mechanisms against foreign bodies that are breathed in. First, some foreign bodies are trapped by the mucous membrane of the respiratory tract and removed by ciliary movement. This prevents them from being carried further into the body. Small foreign particles that get past the first defense mechanism and reach the alveoli inside the lungs are removed by macrophages, which engulf and digest them. Macrophages, which are a kind of white blood cell, constitute the second defense mechanism. But asbestos fibers are extremely fine and are shaped like needles, so even long ones pass through the first defense mechanism and reach the alveoli via the bronchioles. The macrophage has a hard time engulfing these long asbestos fibers, so it releases digestive enzymes outside the cell, setting up an inflammation in order to summon reinforcements. But this simply damages the surrounding healthy lung tissue. The tough asbestos fiber is not removed. If the inflammation and consequent damage persist over a long period, the result is that the lung becomes fibrotic. That is, it hardens and loses elasticity. And if damage to the lung tissue continues over a long period, so that the DNA of the cells lining the interior of the bronchi and the pulmonary alveoli is damaged, lung cancer eventually develops. Over a long period, iron protein attaches itself to some of the asbestos fibers that have collected in the lung, and they take on a characteristic iron dumbbell shape. These are called asbestos bodies. These asbestos bodies do not constitute a disease by themselves, but their presence is important evidence of past exposure to asbestos. Some of the inhaled asbestos fibers do not remain in the lung, but proceed as far as the pleura. When fibrosis of parts of the parietal pleura occurs, characteristic lumps of hardened and thickened tissue called pleural plaques are found. Like asbestos bodies, these pleural plaques are not a specific disease, but their presence is important evidence of exposure to asbestos. Damage caused by asbestos fibers to the DNA of the mesothelial cells lining the pleura over a long period leads to the appearance of malignant tumors called mesothelioma. Asbestos.
So let's summarize these inhalation health risks. Asbestosis is a serious progressive non-cancer disease caused by lung irritation and related scarring. This scarring reduces the lung's ability to function. So remember, because your body cannot break it down and it tries to engulf it, it irritates the lining and causes scarring to occur. And when you think about scar tissue, think about it anywhere on the outside of your body. It does not have the same elasticity as your original tissue. So it makes it harder to breathe. Lung cancer causes the largest amount of or number of deaths related to asbestos exposures. The mesothelioma is really when the sharp asbestos fibers migrate out of the lungs and into other parts of your body, such as the lining of your lungs, the pleura, your chest, your abdomen, and rarely your heart. And it's always a fatal rare form of cancer. So this is what we call the other routes, the secondary routes of exposure is ingestion, where you would either breathe it in and swallow it, or you would eat it or drink it. So that'd be like if you got it in your hands and then you use, it was on your hands from smoking or eating, but this is not thought to be a route of exposure in a school. Dermal would be from working directly with asbestos containing materials, which you would not be doing in the school. So how likely would an exposure to cause a disease? So asbestos related diseases are often dose response related, which what that means is the greater you are exposed to airborne fibers, like the greater the exposure, the more you're exposed, the more frequently, the amounts, then the greater your risk is. How would you know if you've had an asbestos related disease, if you have one? So it's really hard to know because this is what we call latency period, which is the time between an exposure and any health effects. So if you look at the chart below, you'll see that just about under 10 years, you'll start getting developing symptoms. And as you move up in years, the symptoms may become more and more prominent. So from just before 10 years on up to 40 years, it takes to develop these type of diseases. So it's not like, if you were exposed, you would know, like you don't get a sore throat, you wouldn't start necessarily coughing. It's a really what we call a more long-term health effect. So how will being a smoker affect your health risk? Well, cigarette smoking and asbestos exposure multiplies the lung cancer risk by 50 times. And the reason is when you're a smoker, you damage your body's natural ability to sweep out and clean out any foreign particles. So once you damage those mechanisms, then you're more at risk, you increase your risk for that reason. So moving on from the health information, let's talk about, okay, what am I really dealing with here? What am I dealing with here? What is the hazard that I'm presented with? And am I presented with a hazard? Well, you have to look at the type of product you're talking about. Is it a friable or a non-friable product, right? So remember, a non-friable has the asbestos really well bound up into it. And does it contain a small or a large amount of asbestos? So let's think about let's think about pipe wrap for a minute. So pipe wrap has a large amount of asbestos in, or potentially can, and it's also very friable. So that would be a higher asbestos hazard. Where the floor tile and the mastic underneath, the asbestos is really well bound up in it and may not have such a high percent of asbestos. So you also want to look at the condition of it, right? Is it good? Is it sealed? Is it painted? Or is it damaged? And if so, what's the extent of the damage? And remember, you can take something that's non-friable, such as the tile, and once it becomes damaged, then it is friable. And it has to be treated as if it's friable. So what kind of things damage friable asbestos or non-friable asbestos and make them friable? So there's the things that we do on purpose, right? When we're working. So maintenance work, if you're using tools, could disturb it, could break it. Or if you're breaking the seal around lagging to work on the pipes. Then there's vandalism, which is the kids throwing things at the ceiling or other types of vandalism. And then there's accidents, there's while you're working, a broom handle scrapes the ceiling, or there's something falling on or against pipe insulation, or there's bumping or leaning materials on it. So damage can be being unaware that it's asbestos and doing some maintenance work on it, or it can be vandalized, or there can be an accident. Then water is a big source of damage to asbestos from steam leaks, plumbing leaks, and roof leaks. And roof leaks, whenever you see a roof leak, you have to think about what's above that ceiling. Like you might see stains, something like this, where you have damage from water, or steam, it can cause asbestos coating to pull away. They call it delamination from the base material. You could have, if you have a roof leak, you could have ceiling tile breakage and fall on the floor, or the pipe elbows above a ceiling. If you have a roof leak or a pipe leak, because those on the elbows are typically troweled on, they come apart really easily when they get wet, and they fall down on the top of the ceiling tile if you have a drop ceiling. Another thing that could cause asbestos to release fibers is vibration. The most typical would be the HVAC equipment, where you've got a lot of movement in the equipment on a regular basis. And in some circumstances, maybe activity on a floor above from the kids jumping up and down, or doors slamming. If you had a door with asbestos caulking in it, or something outside of the building where you had a lot of construction nearby causing vibration. But it's more typical. The more typical thing would be like HVAC equipment. So how would you know, or how would you recognize damage to friable asbestos? Well, obviously something that you see, suspicious debris. And so something like this above a ceiling, right? This is likely, or this could be in a mechanical room. Then you would look up and you would see, was there a water leak or some other type of damage? Obviously, stained ceiling tiles, which would be a source of, there might be a leak, and clearly visible disturbed pipe insulation. So how do we assess damage? So this is just a visual. It's a little more complicated than this, but basically they look, is it in good condition? Is there minor damage, or is it damaged? And is it significantly damaged? And I created this visual, or I took this visual and I created it on a slide so that you could see what that really means. And when you read a report and it says, something says it was good condition, and here it is like 5 months later, and you go, oh my God, more than 25% in an area is damaged, then that means in that period, you've sustained, or that area sustained more damage. So this is just a way for us to monitor and rank the condition of the asbestos, so that when we determine what we need to do to prevent a release and to maintain this asbestos in place, we have to monitor its condition. And this rating system is a little further complicated by, is the asbestos accessible? Is there a potential to be damaged? A little more detailed, but in essence, this is what we're looking for. And this is what we monitor. And how can we prevent exposures? So number one is know where it is located in your building. And if you do not know it's asbestos, remember that there are some types that are assumed, presumed, or suspected to be asbestos. So it is guilty until you verify otherwise, which means it needs to be tested. So you never ever want to disturb it, whether it's on purpose by doing maintenance, which you guys are not maintenance, but you would never put a hole in a wall or a ceiling without knowing whether it's an asbestos containing material. Now I'm going to move into what do we do as a school district to manage the asbestos in our buildings, and what are the regulations that guide that management? So the Asbestos Hazard Emergency Response Act, called AHERA, is what guides specifically what we do in schools. And if you remember the schematic, there is asbestos on the outside of the buildings and everywhere inside of the buildings and on equipment, on structural members. But the AHERA law only regulates what is from the roof in. It's like what's on the inside of the building. There's one exception, but for the most part, it's just what's inside the building. And their goal behind that was to try and protect building occupants and employees. So here's the one example on the outside of a building that does need to be managed by a school department, and that is the underside of a walkway structure. And in this case, it is asbestos. So here is the big constellation of federal regulations that governs asbestos. So the Environmental Protection Agency governs two of these regulations. And so NESHAP on the left only kicks in if we either going to demolish part of a whole building, or if we're going to do any kind of renovation. Now, AHERA, as we talked about before, is the regulation in schools that we deal with day to day. And so we will dive into that in a minute, but I wanted to explain a little bit more. There are these other regs kick in, not for us as school employees, but under OSHA, if we bring in private industry to do work in a building that either disturbs asbestos or removes it, there's certain training and personal protection requirements that are governed by OSHA. And in Massachusetts, the OSHA part is regulated by the Massachusetts Department of Labor Standards. Well, the AHERA part is regulated by the Department of Labor Standards. There's an aspect of AHERA that requires us to have somebody that oversees this whole program implementation in our school district. They are called our designated person. And in Worcester, that designated person is Kristen Tran. She's our environmental health and safety coordinator. And she is your go-to for all asbestos related questions. And she has the authority and responsibility to oversee all asbestos related management activities in buildings. And she does this in conjunction with the other facility department administrators. Another aspect of AHERA is that we are required to have a site-specific guidance for all of our buildings. And the buildings that are governed by this regulation are basically all our buildings, every school building, our administrative buildings like the DAB, any kind of portable building, our maintenance storage utility buildings, our new bus garage, our warehouse that we use. So basically all our buildings are governed by AHERA. And then for every building, you have to have an asbestos management plan. We call it AMP. It's an asbestos management plan. And this is a very important document. So this is your go-to document. So I'm going to take some time and explain it. And I want you to remember this, because if you have questions, this is the place to start. So it will provide locations and conditions of both documented and suspected asbestos containing material. And the way that you find that information is you look in our inspection reports. And so there are at least 3 kinds of inspection reports. So there's an initial, a 3-year, and a 6-month. And I'll go into more detail in a minute. Then information on who our designated person is, and then recommendations and documentation on any kind of response action. So a response action is whatever we do to manage asbestos, whether it's operations and maintenance or removal. And I'll show you a picture of what that looks like. So more information in the AMP is, so whatever work practices are required. So for you as a custodian, you do floor refinishing, you do burnishing, you do cleaning in areas that might have asbestos. So we'll talk more specifically about what that involves. And then training records, like for this training. There's a fiber release form. So if there's ever a time that you think you've encountered a release or caused a release, you would want to pull this form from the asbestos management plan and make a copy and complete it and give it as well as you can and give it to your supervisor. And if you can't find the report form, you can check with Kristen and she can provide you one. Then I tried to put all of this information into a fact sheet that's also in the asbestos management plan. So if you're looking for the plan, you should find it in the administrative office for every building. If not, contact the designated person. And just so you're aware, it is a living document, which means that we try and keep it up to date. It's updated at least once a year, if not more. And if there's ever a question, if there's any information that's still, that we're in the process of putting it in, you can always contact the designated person if you're looking for something and can't find it. So we want you to always know where this is located and always consult it whenever you have questions about a material. Or if you see somebody doing something and you're wondering, is that asbestos? Maybe I'll go look and let that person know. But again, anytime you need verification of information in your building or information in the asbestos management plan, feel free to always contact the designated person. So the deep dive into these inspections and what you can expect to find when you review them. So the first one that is always done for every building is called an initial survey inspection. And that's either when you're using a new space, like say we go into a new building and we're using part of it, or we get a new building. So this year we have the dual language school, we have a new facilities building with the transportation folks. So we have reports that are generated that identify where the asbestos is and what condition that asbestos is in. We use that information to develop the report. And I just want to make one point about that. So when we do these initial surveys, they're much more complete than the information that was in these initial surveys. These are first started in the 1980s. HERA was required in schools. So there's much more information now than there used to be, because as time has moved on, the Department of Labor standards required more and more sampling. So the 3-year inspection is when we take a really close look at the condition and any changes to that condition from the previous reports. We may conduct sampling, and at the end, they have to provide recommendations for any kind of preventative measures or operations and maintenance, which we'll talk about, or response action. Like, is there anything that we need to do to preserve the condition of this material moving forward? Or if they identify damage, what do we need to do to fix it? Then the 6-month periodic surveillance is a very lightweight inspection just to document any changes in asbestos containing materials. So I want to actually walk you through a 3-year report, because the more you understand how to read it, the more useful it's going to be to you. So this is what the table of contents looks like, but I want to bring your attention to the attachments. So I'm going to blow that up. Here's the attachments. And I will show you what these pages look like after we go through this list, but I want to tell you what you'll find. So the summary of asbestos containing material is just a list of what we've identified that's either been tested or is suspected. And then the inspection and recommended response action table, what that is when they actually go room to room and take a really close-up look at each material. They determine the condition it's in, and they generate recommended response actions. So that's a go-to. And then the attachment D that's where they have a list of non-asbestos containing material. Then there's site drawings and photographs where you might find some useful information. But let's use an example here. So say I'm wondering if a floor tile has asbestos in it, right? So I would start with the summary. So if it said brown asbestos, floor tile 9x9, if it wasn't there, then I would go look in the room. I would say, so attachment B is actually room by room, which I will show you. And so I would look in that room and I would look to see if that 9x9 brown floor tile was there. If I didn't see it there, I would then look in D. So D is non-asbestos containing material. And what that means is anything that's been tested and found to not have asbestos would be listed there. So say I didn't find it in A or B, but I found it in D because it was sampled and found not to have asbestos. So what are the requirements of these inspections? And the reason I want to talk about this with you is because we don't inspect absolutely everything in the building. We only inspect visible locations, because you're only required to do invasive inspections like drill holes or pull things apart if you're going to do renovation or demolition. So we would look in visible locations and also concealed, but only if they're accessible, say like above a drop ceiling. We do not need to inspect or not required to inspect inaccessible areas in the building, unless for some reason there's a reason to believe it could release fibers into other areas. So we do not drill holes in floor walls or ceilings or go above fixed ceilings. We don't go inside of boilers. We don't sample gaskets or valves. We don't sample wiring or pipe tongues. I mean, those are just some examples, but you know, if you think, oh, this is the report's going to have 100% all of the asbestos in this building, it's only the visible and accessible areas. So here is attachment A. So this is the first page that I was saying, take a look at. And I want you to notice something. So here is where you have both the documented and assumed materials. So only 2 of the materials in this building are actually tested and proven to have asbestos. And I tried to highlight all of the stars. I think I missed asterisks. I think I missed a couple, but those are all assumed materials. So, and if you notice, they're all kind of materials that they haven't gone in and torn apart or tried to find. So they're assumed because these are the type of materials that were manufactured the year this building was constructed, or if an addition was constructed. And I want you to notice there's only one outside material that we are required to inspect and manage, and that's the transite over the walkway. Okay, so here's attachment B. So this is really the heart of the inspection report. So the way this page is laid out, or what this is a database report. I helped develop this database years and years ago because I wanted to put everything in plain English so that when somebody read it, it would make sense. So the way it works is the location is on the left. So there's only one location, although there's 2 different materials. And that means in that room, She has 9x9 gray tiles in a plaster base. And look at that. So when it says ACM, asbestos containing materials, yes, they both are. The results, they both been tested. The first one on top, the vinyl asbestos tile, is miscellaneous. And down below, the plaster base is oh, had a brain blip. SM. So, oh, it's surfacing material. Yes. Okay. Sorry, I had a little brain blip. SM. I was thinking S&M. Okay, SM. So anyway, then you look at how much was there. So there's 234 linear square feet. Down on the bottom is also square feet. Is it accessible? Yes, it's accessible. And the reason that that is important is because if it was damaged, it would be a higher risk. Then you look, all right, so the top, the physical assessment is non-friable, there's no damage. Down below, there's potential for damage, but there's none now. So you look, response section is just operations and maintenance. And down below, you want to let a plaster base, you want to let people know that there's asbestos so they won't drill into it. And then there's a basis of the response action. The material is non-friable. And all you need to do is standard floor care, which I will show you, standard asbestos floor care. So here's attachment C. And what this does is this tells you what the, this is attachment, I think this may be attachment D. So this will tell you what they tested and found not to have asbestos, and they're actually doing it by room. They're not doing it just a list of materials. They're doing it by room, and then within that room, they have a list of materials. So here's just an example of a site drawing. And then this attachment G is really helpful because it shows you where it's located and what you can see what condition it's in, and it helps monitor it from year to year. All right, this is moving on. So those were all documents from the 3-year inspection. Now this is the 6-month, and I will show you, illustrate how much simpler this report is, and the information is more limited. So here we are, it shows that it's the first floor, the assistant principal's office. We're talking about the expansion joint. So there's 12 linear feet and it's intact. Okay, so what is considered a change in condition, say for the 6-month report? So any kind of water damage, if there was a fiber release, or there was like delamination of a covering of a pipe insulation. So you would also look for any kind of gougers, punctures, anything crushed or missing coverings. So what we would ask you is, we look every 6 months, but you need to remember you are there every day, 5 days a week, right? So if there's something you see that you know is an asbestos containing material and you see a change in condition, you want to report that to the designated person right away. Because anything like that, then we would send in a vendor to take care of it, or at least to start off doing an evaluation. So moving on from the assessments and the information collected in those inspections is, so we're going to move on to notification. And what that is all about is we are required to report annually to all building occupants and parents about the asbestos reports, which are in the asbestos management plan, in any activities that we're going to do to manage that. So even if there's no asbestos in a building, we are required to have a management plan. So we do for all our buildings. And we notify by emailing notifications to school, posting on the Worcester Public Schools website, and doing trainings like this. We also notify short-term workers and contractors who might come into contact with asbestos when they're in our buildings. So examples would be a utility worker, a telephone repair worker, pest control person, somebody working on a security system, or there's also the fire suppression systems. Anything where we feel like somebody might be encountering a wall, a chase, or anything where they could come in contact with asbestos. And so how would you know if there's asbestos in the area? So this is a little bit of a modified way to notify people. We are required to attach a warning label adjacent to any asbestos containing material and any suspected asbestos containing material only in routine maintenance areas. So what does routine mean? It means something where you might go in on a regular basis or a predictable basis, either scheduled or, you go in and out of the mechanical rooms. So what are considered routine maintenance areas are boiler rooms, equipment rooms, pipe tunnels, and air handling rooms. These are just examples. We are not required to put them out in hallways and in classrooms. So that's why it is a notification, but it is limited. So this is what the sign needs to look like, right? It's yellow. If you see this sign is only used for when we do some kind of larger project. Like if there's a repair or an abatement, they have to put containment to do whatever work that they're doing. They have to contain it. And on the outside of the containment, you would see a sign like this. But for just normal posting and notification, we just need to use the yellow sign. Moving on to training. So we are required to provide you and our maintenance staff with a 2-hour asbestos awareness training just to be around the asbestos. You are not allowed or required to do anything with the asbestos, like you don't repair it, you don't clean it up. So anybody that was going to do disturbing or cleaning activities would be required to do an additional 14-hour training, which we do not here in Worcester. So the operation and maintenance program that we do, so let me just say, operations maintenance, we are trying to prevent fiber release, right? And so we're trying to prevent it by maintaining it in place and by inspecting it. And if we do find it, we do address it by developing plans and bringing in contractors to address any kind of issues. And then we are allowed to maintain it until and if it is removed. We are not required to remove it only if it's damaged and we don't fix it. So let me just say, so this operations and maintenance program is a combination of what we do in-house and what we contract people to do privately. Okay, so the kind of thing that custodians would do, is to maintain the floor tile. So if you're burnishing or buffing, you would only do it if there's sufficient finish on the floor, because you don't want the pad to contact the floor, right? Because the floor, you don't want to be aerosolizing any of the, you don't want to be tearing it up with a pad. So, and you should only do it on an intact floor. So if you have a floor with broken asbestos that has not been stabilized, or, say you had a leak, the floor underneath swelled and buckled and the asbestos on top crumbled, you certainly don't want to burnish or buff that. And when you do, you use the least abrasive pad possible. And we're in the process of making a chart for which schools will use these pads just to make sure. And then we'll want to run the floor machine at a lowest rate of speed possible to get the job done. So when we wet scrub, we also want to make sure there's sufficient finish on the floor to prevent the pad from contacting the floor. And we want to make sure the floor is intact. So it's the same thing, wet scrubbing, use the least abrasive pad. So you might wet scrub instead of wet strip because we might, so there's a program called Scrub and Coat where you don't always strip the floor, you might scrub it and just put another layer of finish on. In that case, you use the least abrasive pad, you run the floor machine at the lowest rate of speed, and then you would use a wet vac to pick up the water. So the only other thing I don't have a slide for, but is when we wet strip, we never dry strip. Some people dry strip doing using equipment, but we never dry strip because a lot of our floors do contain asbestos. So let's talk about your other work practices. And we have special work practices that have to be used around a building with friable asbestos. So that's why you need to know which buildings have friable asbestos. So why can't you use regular cleaning practices in a building with a friable asbestos? Because you want to keep the friable asbestos, you want to keep the asbestos fibers out of the air. In order to prevent releasing fibers, you don't dust, sweep, or vacuum without a HEPA filter. And the reason you don't dust or sweep is you don't want to blow things around. That's more obvious. The thing to know about vacuums that don't have a HEPA filter is that they will blow just dust out the back. They will contain some, but not all of the dust. So you want to prevent contacting and disturbing any asbestos, and you want to prevent water damage. And you want to make sure that you strip and burnish your floor correctly. So this really boils down to two things, right? So regardless of whether or not you're doing the floors, the walls, curtains, carpeting, books, whatever, you always wet clean. So that's wet mop, wet strip, wet wipe. And when you vacuum with a HEPA vac. So we have been working to replace our old vacuums with HEPA vacs. If you're in a building with asbestos, there's not a lot, there's only one building in Belmont has sprayed on asbestos on the ceiling. Otherwise, schools only need to deal with the wet cleaning in areas such as the boiler rooms, any mechanical rooms. And I know it's hard to think about sweeping or to wet mop in a mechanical room. So it's a challenge. So you might need to pick up materials and then wet mop or vacuum. There's also schools that have the PCBs in caulking that are required to do wet cleaning. But as we go through and replace more and more of the windows, we've reduced the number of schools that we need to do that with, and that they have specific cleaning practices. So here's the response actions that we have conducted by contractors. You are not responsible for the following. So you would never remove asbestos. We have private contractors, certified, licensed contractors to do this. You would also not repair or clean up a spill of asbestos, all private. Okay, we might have asbestos enclosed, and what that means is it forms an airtight, impermeable, permanent barrier to prevent release. Or encapsulation, where you surround or embed asbestos in an adhesive matrix to prevent release. So these are all done, all four that I just shared, the slide before and this slide, are all done by private vendors. We do not, our employees do not do any work on asbestos containing materials, whether it's cleaning them up or repairing them or removing them. So moving on to what happens if there is a release of asbestos. So these are categories by minor and major. So a minor would be dislodging of 3 square feet or lineal feet or less of friable asbestos. So that could be just a few ceiling tiles or 3 or less broken floor tiles. A major would be dislodging of more than 3 square or linear feet of friable asbestos. So that could be, a ceiling release or a major damage from water leak on the floor. So this is an example of what that might look like. So this is where spray-on applied insulation or a textured finish or asbestos pipe insulation might fall down on top of a drop ceiling. Or you can see on the right, there's a texture coat debris on the ceiling tiles and on the light fixtures. So this is considered a release. What would you do? In this case, you want to report this immediately to your supervisor. So your immediate supervisor. So, and then if your supervisor said you need to call a designated person, or you need to call Tom, or you need to call somebody, they will tell you. And then you want the type of thing that you would report is if you see debris like I just showed you, or you see evidence like you see a leak, you see that maybe the pipe insulation looks like it's about to fall, and it could be either known or suspected asbestos containing material. So your role during a fiber release is you want to restrict entry into the area, right? That makes sense. You don't want people to tracking through any released asbestos or being exposed. And if there is a possibility that the fibers from the release could migrate to other locations through the ventilation system, check with your supervisor about whether or not you should shut down the handling system or temporarily modify it. And be prepared to explain what happened. And as discussed before, obtain a copy of the fiber release report in each building's asbestos management plan, or you can call and get a copy if you can't find one. Fill out what you can and submit it to your supervisor. Takeaway points. Know where documented or suspected asbestos containing materials are located in the buildings that you're working with. And in order to do that, you need to know how to read the inspection reports. And if you still have a question after reviewing those, is you want to contact the designated person. And you want to use required cleaning practices around any friable insulation, remember, or friable asbestos containing material, as in mechanical rooms. And so that is wet cleaning, wet cleaning, wet mopping, and using of HEPA-Vacs. And you never want to disturb any assumed or documented asbestos containing material. And you want to make sure that you do report any disturbances, damages, or releases of assumed or documented. And please, please, please always feel free to contact the designated person. So last slide, I want you to remind you to take the quiz and return it to Kristen Tran. She will have put a date in the email that she sent to you, and make sure that you give it to her. So I want to thank you for listening. I know it's a lot of information, and it's really to protect you and building occupants. And if there's anything else you need to understand, we're happy to go over it with you. And you take care. And thank you for doing the work that you do.